Hi, it's Carolyn. I'm here to help you learn how to bake and decorate amazing cakes, and in this video I'm going to show you how to decorate this Sesame Street cake. It is one of my most popular designs, and every time I make it and I post the picture, people ask me how I did it, and I finally got around to filming the entire thing. So this video is going to be a little lengthy. I will put chapters down below for you. Like always, I am starting with my cakes already baked, filled, iced, and they are in the refrigerator waiting to be decorated. I have tons of videos showing you how I do that entire process that will be linked below. And just a reminder, all of the videos that I reference and any of the tools that I use will be linked in the description as well. So let's get started. I always tell you that I print out the pictures the size I wanted them to be, and I like to check after I print them out to make sure they're the right size. So all these pictures will be linked down in the description, but I measure the cake and then I make sure that I printed those out a little shorter so they would fit on there, and then also that I would have enough room for that sign. So I just like to hold them up against the cake and make sure I printed them out the right size. Now I have Gumtex powder, Tylose powder, CMC powder. It's all basically the same thing. It is mixed into my marshmallow fondant. I only use marshmallow fondant. I need a little bit in there, roll it out, let it sit, and it's going to set harder and be so much easier to work with. I will link this in the description. I have a piece of non-slip pad underneath my cutting board so it doesn't slide around, an X-Acto knife with a wet paper towel that I can keep wiping off the blade, a Dresden tool, and a little bit of water. And I rolled out this yellow fondant, kind of medium thick, not too thin, not too thick. And I'm doing my trace, cut, and smooth method on here. So I'm tracing all of this detail onto that fondant so the lines transfer. And then I want to take my Dresden tool and just deepen the inner detail lines first. And since this is a thicker piece of fondant, I always like to make a shallow cut first. That way I create a guideline and I won't mess up the fondant when I cut it out. Once that guideline is done, then I stick the tip all the way down to the cutting board and cut it out. So with a shallow cut, it's just the tip of the blade that's in there, and then I'll cut the entire thing out. And anytime I cut anything out of fondant, it is a little jagged, so I like to take my fingers and my tools and smooth my cuts. Now I need to make the little beak, so I have some thinner yellow fondant and I am tracing the beak on there, and then I'm making sure that I get those inner details as well. And I want to trace the inner part of the mouth onto this red fondant, and then the tongue onto pink fondant. So it's trace, cut, and smooth is the technique to make all of these. So after I trace it on there, I cut it out and then take my fingers and smooth my cuts. And that's what I'm going to be doing for all of these characters. Now I want to make a room for that tongue, so I'm just cutting that little section out of the red part. That way the pink part of the tongue will sit flush with it and it won't be sticking out and it won't look weird. Then I cut out that center part of the mouth of the yellow part before I cut the rest of this out of fondant. It's just a lot easier to cut the center pieces first. And then I can fit that red part of the mouth in there. And let's first get some water behind here and stick this down. So I have the picture close for reference and I'm making sure that I'm putting that on the right angle. And then getting a little bit of water behind the red part and sticking that down. And the same thing for the pink tongue. I'm just deepening the details with my Dresden tool. Now, Big Bird's eyes are a little confusing, so I hope I can explain this right. I'm cutting pink dots and blue dots of the same size, just using a piping tip. And then I'm using that same piping tip and cutting a large section of that pink part off. Do you see how it is in the picture? And I'm doing the same for the blue dot. I'm cutting a large section off, but this time for the blue dot, I'm saving that wider bottom piece. And I'm doing that for the other one as well, removing that little crescent section and keeping the wider part. Now I'm bumping that blue part up against the pink part, and then I need to trim the rest of the blue part off. So I got a slightly bigger piping tip, and I'm just looking at the picture. Do you see how the blue is a little thinner than the pink? So I'm just trimming that blue section off with the piping tip to make it look like the picture. And now these tiny pieces are really difficult to work with, but I'm getting a little bit of water behind the blue and the pink strips and just using the edge of my paintbrush to make sure that these are in the correct position. And I put them on a piece of white fondant, and now I can take a piping tip and just make sure those blue and pink pieces are in the piping tip and cut out a circle. So now that looks like his eyes. They are a little kind of a pain in the butt to make, but this is just the most effective way that I've found to make them. And then since they are butt up against the top of the beak, I just trimmed them with a circle cutter, get a little bit of water behind the eyes and stick those down. And then I'm using a small piping tip to make the pupils and sticking them down as well. And there is Big Bird. I'm going to set him aside, and now we're going to start to work on Grover. So again, I have that blue fondant. It's like a medium thickness. I'm tracing all of this detail on there, and then I take my Dresden tool and deepen the detail. And this is a thicker piece of fondant, so I'm just using the tip of my knife to make a shallow cut first. And once the shallow cut is done, I am going to stick the tip all the way down to the cutting board and cut this out, wiping that tip of my blade on that wet paper towel as the fondant starts to stick to it. And then taking my tools and my fingers to smooth my cuts. So I'm going to repeat this process the whole time doing this. So let's trace that black part onto the black fondant, the red part onto the red fondant, cut those out, smooth my cuts. And I am going to place these on here to make sure I have them in the right position. Now, right where that black part is going to touch the top of the fondant, I wanted to press the fondant down a little bit so that way the black part, the top part of the black, sits flush with the blue and it doesn't look like it's just sticking out. I got a little bit of water behind both of those pieces and stuck those down. Now I'm holding a little oval cutter and that looks about the right size, and I have some thicker pink fondant and I'm just cutting an oval for his nose, smoothing my cuts. And let's just put that down there. I'm not going to glue it down yet. And then I'm tracing and cutting out the eyes. Now get a little bit of water behind the eyes. Do you see how his eyes are slanted down? I always have the picture close for reference. You want to make it look like the picture. If you don't, he's going to look a little off and he's going to look weird. So just try to make it look as close to the picture as you can. And that looks good. I'm going to set him aside and let's try Oscar doing the same thing. Let's trace him onto that green fondant, making sure that I get that inner detail, and then taking my Dresden tool and deepening that inner detail. And then I'm going to trace the black onto the black and take my Dresden tool and press that section down where the black is going to touch the top of the green. And you see how now the black sits flush against the green. And then with the eyebrows, there are all of these little sections here. So I'm just working in small sections to make sure that I don't cut any of those points off. And then again, taking the time and smoothing all of those jagged edges. And then getting a little bit of water down behind those little pieces and sticking these down. And again, I'm holding the picture close for reference and making sure that I just get everything in the right position. And once I have that all on here, I'm cutting it out, smoothing my cuts, and let's set him aside. Now let's shade these in. So I have this huge container of all the dust that I ever use. And I'm gonna have these pictures close, and I have some paintbrushes here. And a little bit goes a long way with these dusts, so I like to tap my brush onto the lid and then tap it off on the paper towel. That way, you can always add more color. You can't take it away. So I just like to work in little sections at a time. And dusting your pieces, it's just like adding makeup. It makes it look so much better. It really brings it to life. So I'm looking at the picture. Do you see how there's kind of like orange detail in there? So I have some orange dust and a brush with a really thin head so I can get in those tiny details, and I'm just shading it in, trying to make it look like the picture. And with Grover, I'm just deepening his nose with a little bit of that carnation pink, I think it is. Everything that I use will be linked in the description. If I can't find the exact thing, I will find something similar and link it below for you. But just gently shading this in. And you really can't tell a difference with Grover. It is very subtle, but it still does make him look so much better. And that looks good. I'm just going to set these aside to dry flat. And now let's make the sign. So again, I am tracing this inner part onto this green fondant, making sure I have a steady hand. I want to make sure it's straight as possible. And then cutting it out. And I'm going to smooth my cuts. And I'm going to take a round
circle cutter and just cut a circle out for that top section. And I'm just taking my X-Acto knife and trying to measure out how tall it is, and then I kind of stick it on top of there and then just trim off that excess because you want a yellow border between that little half circle and the sign. Now I'm getting a little bit of water behind this green piece and sticking that down on the thin yellow fondant and using my ruler to make sure everything is nice and straight. And then getting some water behind the half circle as well. And I'm just getting really close and cutting an even yellow border around this entire thing. And doing the same trace, cut, and smooth method for the name. So with these letters, you want to make sure you trace those inner sections as well as the outer part of the letter. And I always cut out the intersections first. It's just so much easier to cut those out and smooth those before you cut the rest of the letter out of fondant. So I'm just cutting all of these letters out, and as I cut them out, taking my time and smoothing my cuts. And I just want to place these letters on the sign just to make sure that I get them in the right position before I glue them down. And I'm just freehand cutting a number 1 for that top section. Getting a little bit of water behind it and stick that down and making sure these letters are in the right position, and then just getting a little bit of water behind each one and gluing them to the sign. And I don't want this to dry out. I'm going to store it in a Ziploc bag, and let's set that aside. Now we're doing the same technique for Elmo. So I have some orange fondant. I'm tracing the nose onto there. I didn't have a cutter that was that size, so I just had to trace it on there. And for the eyes, I'm going to use cutters. So I just hold these circle cutters up there, and I said that one looks like it's the right size. And I'm cutting that out of a medium thickness white fondant. And once I smooth that out, I'm going to cut the other one out. But do you see how the eye on the right is kind of cut off by the eye on the left? So I'm making sure that I cut it out so there's a little piece missing so it sits flush next to the one on the left. And then there's a section of that nose that's cut out of the eyes. So I'm just taking that round cutter and just cutting the bottom part of the eyes out so the nose sits flush just like the picture. And then I want to do the same thing for the pupils. So I just held that little piping tip up to the picture to make sure it was the right size, get a little bit of water behind those and stick them down. And I'm tracing the mouth onto the black fondant and cutting that out as well. And I don't want these to dry out either, so I am storing them in a Ziploc bag until I'm ready to put them on the cake. Now I'm making the letters for the number topper. That blue was rolled out pretty thick. I need to be able to get a toothpick underneath it. So again, I just printed that out the size that I wanted it to be. And I am tracing the N on one and the E on the other. And I am making a shallow cut first since that is thicker fondant. And then once that shallow cut is done, I stick the tip all the way down, cut that out, smooth my cuts. And I'm going to set those aside. Now, I have these chocolate chips here. I show you in a video how I chop these up to get a nice variation, and I will link that in the description. So I'm just scooping out a little bit of these on the counter, and I have some ivory colored fondant here. And what I'm doing, I'm kind of kneading that fondant over that chocolate chip dust to kind of get these chips mixed into this fondant and make it look like a cookie. So I rolled it into a ball, and I'm flattening it down, and I'm trying to flatten the edges, but I want to keep it a little thicker in the middle. This is going on top of the cake. So I'm grabbing some chocolate chips and sticking them in there as well. And I have a video where I go into detail on how I make these chocolate chip cookies. I will link that in the description. And that looks good. And now I'm going to make a bunch of smaller ones. So I'm taking the rest of that ivory fondant, kneading that on top of that chocolate chip dust, and then breaking little pieces off and rolling them into a ball and flattening them down. And once I have all of them done, I'm taking my fingers and just pinching the edges just to make them look a little more like a cookie and not just these round discs. And then I'm tapping my finger into that chocolate chip dust and just pressing it onto the top of the cookies as well. Now I'm getting some aluminum foil here and I'm crumbling it up into a ball, and then I'm pressing that foil on top of those fondant cookies just to give them some texture and make them look more realistic. And after I do that, I like to take another piece and just crumble it up again. That way I get a variation in the texture. And then I'm taking my Dresden tool and just making random lines in these chocolate chip cookies because cookies naturally have these little cracks in them, and I just want to make them look a little more realistic. And now I have this cinnamon chocolate and dark chocolate petal dust. The company that I got these from closed, but I can find similar ones and link them below. And I'm just getting a little bit of that on my paintbrush and tapping it on the edges of the cookies just to make them look a little bit more realistic. And then after I did the cinnamon, which is like a little more orange, then I go into the chocolate, which is a medium brown, and just do the same thing. And I didn't use too much of the dark brown because it just didn't look right. But with this cookie, that goes on top, I flipped it over and I'm getting a little bit of dust on the back because you will be able to see that from the back. And there's the cookies. Let's set those aside. Now I am making Cookie Monster's face. So I printed that out really small. I needed to make sure that it would fit on the N. And again, I'm just doing the trace, cut, and smooth method to cut out the eyes and the mouth. Now, Cookie Monster's eyes, you see the picture? Do you see how the left eye, the pupil is going down towards the center and the right one is going up towards the center? You want to pay attention to that when you're putting that on the cake. And now I want to make some curly, so I cut a straight line down and then a curvy line on the left, a curvy line on the right, and it comes to a point. So I'm putting different color curlies on the cake, but I wanted to show you how I make them, so in case you didn't know how to do it, but I put them on a lot of my cakes. So I cut a bunch of those out, and then once I have each strip, I wrap it around my Dresden tool and then set that aside to dry. And you see how I did that in all the colors of the rainbow. And now I'm taking a piping tip and cutting out a bunch of polka dots, and I'm going to set that on the same cutting board as my little curlies. And let's set those aside until I'm ready to put them on the cake. Now let's stack the cake. I got that cake out of the refrigerator. The icing is cold and hard and I'm not going to mess it up. I'm using my sewing ruler to measure how tall the straws need to be. And then I'm taking a bubble tea straw on top of that ruler and marking the edge with a Sharpie marker. And then I take my scissors and cut that marker off and I throw that piece in the trash. And then I countersink all of those straws down into the cake. Make sure the cake is level. Get a little bit of icing down. And then I'm going to put on the top tier. So I always wash my hands when I touch my cakes, and my hands are always clean. And then I'm removing that from that cake circle, remove the tape. That cardboard circle is going to sit atop of the straws, and it's not going to collapse. I have a video where I go into full detail on how I stack cakes that will be linked in the description. I'm doweling the cake, and now I want to add this textured buttercream. So I have some more red buttercream here, and I want to put a very thin layer of this icing on here. I'm trying to make sure that the tip of that spatula goes all the way down to the bottom of the cake and it touches that white cake. I will clean it up later, but I want to make sure I have a really thin layer of icing all the way up the sides of the cake and on the top. And then I'm going to take my gloved hands and I just want to give it a little tappy like Happy Gilmore. And I always say that, tap, tap, taparoo. And I'm just tapping this icing with my gloved hands to give it a fur effect. And as that wasn't really working that well, I started grabbing a little bit more icing out of that container on my glove and tapping that against the cake as well. And this way it gives it a nice little Elmo furry effect. And I'm taking my pinky finger towards the bottom and just making sure the fur effect goes all the way to the bottom. I'm going to clean up the top part of that white cake when I'm finished. So I'm taking a spatula, and remember that cake is cold and hard and solid. I'm not going to mess it up as I'm scraping this off. So I'm just gently removing that excess red icing that is on there. And once I have it all scraped off, I'm going to grab a paintbrush. I'm going to dip that in a little bit of water and just use that wet paintbrush to remove any excess red that is on that white tier. If I do it as soon as I get that red icing on the white tier and that cake is cold, I can remove it pretty easily. Now I have some piping gel, and I'm getting piping gel behind the Elmo mouth on the corners, and then I'm going to get a little bit of that red icing behind the mouth in the center. That red icing on the top tier is still wet, so this icing is going to stick to the icing and it's really going to hold it on there. So I'm putting that mouth closer to the bottom edge of that red cake. I don't have it all the way down at the bottom. That would look a little weird, so I want to leave a little bit of red at the bottom. Then I got some icing behind that orange nose and stuck that down. And I'm doing the same thing. Get some red icing behind the white eyes, and then I'm holding them up and sticking them down as well. making sure they're really pressed against the cake. The icing behind those pieces is going to really solidify when I put it back in the refrigerator, and those won't be going nowhere. I want to roll out this piece of purple fondant really long and then use my ribbon cutter to cut a ribbon, and that's going to be the border on the bottom tier. So I'm getting a little piping gel and dip that in water just to thin it out a little bit, and getting that along the bottom of the bottom tier. And I'm going to start in the very back and wrap that around there, and where it meets in the back, use my X-Acto knife to just cut it. I'm going to press that seam together and press that down to make sure it's nice and even. I'm getting a little bit of icing behind Oscar, and I'm going to stick him to the cake. And again, like I said, when I put this cake back in the refrigerator, the icing is going to solidify and it's going to really hold it on there. There was some icing sticking out the side, so I just get a dry paintbrush and remove that icing so you can't see the icing when you turn the cake to the side. I like to remove it as much as I can. And I got some icing behind Big Bird, and again, I'm going to stick him down and remove the excess icing. And then I'm going to do the same thing for Oscar as well. That's not Oscar, that's Grover. You know what I mean. And then for the name, the top part of the name is going to be sticking off of the cake, so I only want to get a little bit of piping gel and icing down on the bottom half of that sign. And then I made sure everything was center to Elmo's face, and I stuck that down. And now I'm cutting a bunch of these polka dots in half, because I like to do halvesies when I do my polka dots. So I got a little bit of water behind half one, and I stuck the half one down against that border, and then I'm doing some whole ones. So I use the half polka dots down at the bottom and up at the top. And I just like how it looks. I've been doing it like that for years. You don't have to if you don't want to. But I got polka dots around the bottom tier, and then I have some blue American buttercream icing, and this is going to be on the cake board. So I'm just gently putting this down on the cake board, making sure I push it all the way up to that purple border and all the way to the edge of the cake drum. And then once I have that done, I'm taking my spatula and just lifting it up off of the icing to give it that fur effect like Cookie Monster. And then while that icing is still sticky, I grab those smaller chocolate chip cookies, and I'm just kind of placing these on here. No rhyme or reason. I try to do like 2 together, and then I have 1 single, and then I do 2 together. You know, I have one on an angle on top just to make it look a little haphazard, if you will. And then I'm holding this up to make sure that I have enough room. I'm like, oh crap, that one cookie is a little too big. So I'm going to have the N and the E set a little bit back behind it. That's okay. So I'm getting 2 skewers in the bottom. That way it won't turn or rotate as I put it in the cake. And I'm just sliding this down onto the top of the cake. And I need to make sure the N and the E have enough room, and luckily they do. So I have gloved hands, and again, I'm doing the little tappy tap technique and tapping this fur on here, so it's going to be like Cookie Monster. And then I take a palette knife, because those intersections of the N are a little difficult to get to, and I want to make sure there's icing in there. I got toothpicks underneath both stems of that letter. Is it stems? I don't know. And I stuck that down. I'm doing the same thing for the E, and I use my palette knife to get in those little crevices and get a toothpick underneath that. And those letters have dried overnight, so they can stand on their own without getting distorted, and that icing is still sticky, so I'm sticking down the eyes and the mouth. And now I just have my curlies, and I'm getting a little bit of piping gel behind each of the curlies and sticking them down to the top of the bottom tier. And since I have a curly addiction, I have a curly container, and I just like to store extra curlies in here. That way I don't always have to make them. So I'm just putting the extra ones in here, and then I have some silver and gold ones in there, and let's close that and set that aside. And now I'm taking the lid of my little glue stick and just pressing the aluminum foil against that cake drum so it's not sticking out and it's smooth. Get a little bit of glue around that edge, and I got some glue around the back part of that red ribbon, and I'm wrapping this around the cake. Where it overlaps in the back, get a little more glue down, and I just want to press my finger down and then just run my finger over that one more time for good measure. And here is a Sesame Street cake. How cute is that?
So there you go, there is the Sesame Street cake, and like I said in the beginning, this is one of my most popular designs. I have made it so many times. Now this cake on the inside, the top tier is a 2-layer not torted 4-inch, and the bottom tier is a 2-layer torted 6-inch, and I have a video where I talk about when I tort and when I don't tort my cakes, and I will link that in the description. I have also made this one many times, the top tier being a 2-layer torted 5-inch and the bottom tier being a 2-layer torted 7-inch. So I have done variations of this design so much. And I don't know about you, do you get design requests like of a specific cake that you make all the time? And I don't want to say that I'm getting sick of making it. I just want to do something else. I want to do something else with Elmo. Like I've done Sesame Street cakes with 3D Elmo, and I love doing that. And I've done like a 3D Oscar the Grouch, and that one was so much fun to make. But people see this design, they just want it. So I end up making the same thing, and I kind of feel like I'm in a rut now, and I want to do something new. So hopefully I'll get an order for a Sesame Street cake where they say I could do whatever I want. So I think that's it. What new techniques did you learn in this video? I would love to know. Leave it in the comments below. And just a reminder, I do have a Cake Academy membership program where I can help you elevate your cakes to the next level. All of that information will be listed in the description. Please like this video if you liked it, and if you are enjoying my tutorials, I would be so grateful if you could buy me a coffee. My link is down below. And I would love it if you would keep in touch on socials, and you could check out my website. And if you want to stick around, you can watch this video next, and hit subscribe and the bell if you haven't already. Thank you so much for watching. I love you guys. And remember, it's cake. Have fun. I will see you on the next one. Bye.